The 17th century dawned with a whisper of change, a nascent hunger stirring in the heart of Europe. It was an era defined by ambition, by the relentless pursuit of the unknown, and by the irresistible allure of riches beyond imagination. The world, vast and largely unmapped, lay open like a treasure chest, its exotic spices, shimmering silks, and untold mineral wealth beckoning across treacherous seas. Nations, fueled by nascent mercantilism and a thirst for dominance, dispatched their fleets, their flags unfurling in the salt-laden winds, eager to carve out empires and secure their place in a rapidly expanding global tapestry. This was a time when the lines between exploration and exploitation blurred, when the promise of paradise often hid a darker, more brutal reality. Amidst this feverish quest for dominion, a new entity emerged, one that would redefine the very nature of power, commerce, and control. It was not a king nor an emperor, but a company. The Dutch East India Company, or Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie, was born from the pragmatic spirit of a small but fiercely ambitious republic. Conceived not as a mere trading venture, but as a revolutionary fusion of private enterprise and state power, it was granted unprecedented authority. Imagine a corporation today not just operating across continents, but wielding its own armies, forging its own treaties, and even minting its own currency. The VOC was precisely that, a privately owned, government-backed leviathan, a commercial colossus whose capitalization would, in modern terms, dwarf even today's trillion-dollar tech giants. Its initial charter, granted in 1602, was not merely a license to trade, it was a mandate to conquer. The motivations were clear and intensely practical: wealth above all else, the spices of the East, nutmeg, clove, cinnamon, pepper, were more than just flavorings. They were commodities as valuable as gold, driving the economies of nations and fueling luxurious lifestyles. The established trade routes, dominated by Portuguese and Spanish monopolies, were slow and inefficient. The Dutch saw an opportunity, a chance to bypass these entrenched powers, to sail directly to the source, and to bring these precious goods to European markets with unparalleled speed and efficiency. This was the genesis of a global enterprise, an economic engine unlike any the world had ever seen. The VOC's early triumphs were swift and breathtaking. Its formidable fleet, bristling with cannons and laden with goods, traversed the perilous Cape of Good Hope, establishing a network of trading posts, factories and fortifications across Asia. From the bustling ports of Persia to the exotic markets of Japan, the company's presence grew, its red, white, and blue flag becoming a familiar and increasingly feared sight. They outmaneuvered rivals, negotiated shrewdly with local rulers, and when negotiations failed, they acted decisively, with a ruthlessness that quickly became their hallmark. The sheer scale of their operations, the audacity of their ambition, and the speed of their expansion were unprecedented. The world watched, some in awe, others in trepidation, as this corporate juggernaut asserted its dominance. But beneath the veneer of commercial success and strategic brilliance lay the first hint of a darker truth. The VOC's efficiency was not merely economic. It was also brutally effective in its disregard for local sovereignty and human cost. Early encounters with indigenous populations were often marked by coercion, intimidation, and violence. The company's unwavering focus on profit and control meant that any obstacle, whether it be a rival European power or a local chieftain, was met with overwhelming force. The seeds of future conflicts, of widespread suffering and exploitation, were sown in these early years, hidden beneath the impressive ledgers filled with burgeoning profits. How did a single corporation, born from the mercantile ambitions of a small European nation, amass such unimaginable power, effectively becoming an empire unto itself? And perhaps more critically, what was the true, enduring cost of such immense, unchecked corporate might? The answers lay not just in the annals of economic history, but in the untold stories of those whose lives were irrevocably altered by the shadow of this omnipresent giant. The Dutch East India Company, or VOC as it was universally known, was far more than a mere trading enterprise. It was a state within a state, a corporate entity endowed with powers traditionally reserved for monarchs and governments. Its structure was a marvel of early capitalism and imperial ambition, designed for maximum efficiency and ruthless expansion. At its apex sat the Heren 17, the Lord 17, a board of 17 directors who dictated policy from Amsterdam, representing the diverse interests of the company's various chambers across the Netherlands. Below them, a complex hierarchy of governors general, commanders and merchants managed the vast overseas operations, each layer meticulously designed to funnel wealth back to the distant shareholders. These shareholders, a revolutionary concept at the time, were the true owners, their investments fueling the VOC's insatiable appetite for dominance and profit. What truly set the VOC apart, however, were the unprecedented powers granted to it by the Dutch States General. This wasn't merely a charter for commerce, it was a delegation of sovereign authority. The VOC possessed the unique right to wage war, to raise and maintain its own armies and navies, to negotiate and sign treaties with foreign powers, to establish colonies, and even to mint its own currency. These were not privileges. They were the very sinews of empire, bestowed upon a private corporation. This unparalleled legal framework transformed the VOC from a trading company into a de facto colonial power, blurring the lines between private enterprise and statecraft in a way that would define global commerce for centuries to come. Armed with these extraordinary prerogatives, the VOC embarked on a systematic campaign of strategic acquisition. Its keen strategists swiftly identified and seized control of crucial territories and trade choke points across Southeast Asia. Java became the heart of its administrative and military operations, with Batavia evolving into a fortified capital, a microcosm of Dutch society transplanted onto foreign soil. The Strait of Malacca, a vital maritime gateway, fell under its sway, ensuring control over the lucrative sea lanes connecting the Indian Ocean to the Pacific. Ceylon, rich in cinnamon, was wrestled from Portuguese control, and the Cape of Good Hope became a crucial refreshment station, solidifying the company's logistical network. Each acquisition was not a random act, but a calculated move in a grand chess game of global domination, designed to secure monopolies and eliminate competition. The methods employed to achieve this dominance were often brutal and uncompromising. Rival European traders, particularly the Portuguese and English, were met with fierce military resistance, their ships sunk, their trading posts besieged. But it was the indigenous resistance that bore the brunt of the VOC's unyielding ambition. Local rulers who dared to defy the company's dictates found their kingdoms ravaged, their populations subjugated, and their resources plundered. The sophisticated military machine of the VOC, comprising well-trained mercenaries and heavily armed ships, was used without hesitation to enforce its will, crushing any semblance of local autonomy. This was not trade based on mutual consent. It was commerce enforced by cannon and sword. Behind these grand strategies and brutal tactics were key figures whose ambition and ruthlessness shaped the VOC's trajectory. Directors like Jan Pieterszoon Cohen, a man of iron will and unwavering conviction, epitomized the company's ethos. Cohen, who served as Governor-General, famously declared, "Despair not, spare your enemies not, for God is with us." His philosophy was simple: Trade could not exist without war, and war must be waged mercilessly to secure monopoly. Cunning commanders, often former soldiers of fortune, executed these directives with brutal efficiency, their names etched in the annals of colonial violence. These were men driven by a potent mix of religious fervor, national pride, and an insatiable hunger for personal wealth and corporate power. In pursuit of profit and dominance, the VOC made its first, but certainly not its last, ethical compromises. The concept of fair trade was an alien notion. Instead, the company imposed harsh trading terms, often forcing local producers to sell their goods exclusively to the VOC at artificially low prices. Any defiance was met with punitive expeditions, resulting in massacres, destruction of crops, and the enslavement of entire communities. The immense wealth flowing into Amsterdam was built upon a foundation of exploitation, intimidation, and violence, a stark contrast to the veneer of civilized commerce that the Dutch sought to project. The vast power granted to this corporate entity, coupled with the immense distances separating its operations from the oversight of the Dutch government, created an environment where accountability was a distant whisper, and moral boundaries were easily blurred, then erased. This raises a profound question, one that echoes through centuries and remains relevant today. Was the VOC's unprecedented rise a testament to groundbreaking innovation in corporate organization, a pioneering model of global enterprise, or was it, in its essence, merely legalized piracy on a global scale, an empire built not on legitimate trade but on the systematic subjugation and exploitation of peoples and resources, all under the guise of commercial endeavor? The answer, as history would reveal, was likely a complex and disturbing blend of both. The true heart of the VOC's initial, unimaginable wealth beat in the distant Maluku Islands, a cluster of emerald jewels scattered across the equatorial Pacific. These were the fabled Spice Islands, a name that shimmered with exotic allure and promised unimaginable riches. It was here that nature had bestowed its most precious gifts, the aromatic nutmeg, the pungent clove, and the delicate mace, spices so coveted in Europe that they were worth more than gold, capable of transforming mundane meals into feasts fit for royalty. This insatiable demand for flavors that could mask spoilage and tantalize palates across continents fueled an unprecedented greed, driving men and ships halfway around the world, transforming distant archipelagos into battlegrounds for corporate dominion. Among these islands, the Banda Archipelago held a particular significance, possessing the sole global source of nutmeg and mace. This unique botanical lottery made Banda the ultimate prize, the linchpin of the VOC's burgeoning empire. The company's ambition was not merely to trade in these spices, but to control their entire supply, to establish what would become known as the monopoly of nutmeg. This was not just business, it was an audacious, a violent declaration of absolute economic control. To achieve this, the VOC unleashed its most ruthless agent, Jan Pieterszoon Cohen, whose name would forever be synonymous with the company's darkest chapter. Cohen, with a cold, calculating resolve, launched a brutal campaign against the inhabitants of the Banda Islands in 1621. His mission was clear: eradicate any local resistance, seize control of every nutmeg tree, and establish a Dutch-controlled plantation system. The campaign was nothing short of genocide. The indigenous Bandanese, a thriving and sophisticated trading society, were systematically slaughtered, their villages burned, their culture annihilated. Those who were not killed outright were enslaved and forced to work the very plantations that had once been their ancestral lands. The once vibrant population of Banda, estimated to be around 15,000, was reduced to a mere few hundred within months, replaced by Dutch colonists and slave laborers brought from other parts of Asia. The monopoly of nutmeg was secured, but at an unspeakable cost, cementing the VOC's reputation for unbridled brutality in pursuit of profit. The systematic displacement and enslavement of local populations became a grim blueprint for the VOC's operations across its expanding territories. From the pepper fields of Sumatra to the coffee plantations of Java, the company perfected a system of forced labor and resource extraction that prioritized yield above all else. Human lives were reduced to mere cogs in a vast profit-generating machine. The idyllic images of exotic spice-producing islands, often painted by European artists, belied the horrific reality of suffering and exploitation that underpinned their bounty. The rich aromas of nutmeg and cloves carried with them the faint but unmistakable scent of blood and tears. This era was also marked by profound betrayals, not just by the distant European invaders, but often among indigenous leaders themselves, manipulated and exploited by the cunning tactics of the VOC. The company masterfully employed a strategy of divide and conquer, exacerbating existing rivalries between local rulers, promising alliances and protection in exchange for exclusive trading rights or military aid against their neighbors. These promises, however, were rarely kept. Once a local power had served its purpose in dismantling a competitor or securing a VOC objective, they too would often find themselves subjugated, their autonomy stripped away. Treaties signed under duress, often misunderstood or deliberately misinterpreted, became instruments of subjugation. The lure of temporary power or wealth proved to be a fatal trap for many as they watched their communities and their cultures slowly dismembered by the very entity they had, however briefly, aligned with. The betrayal was a double-edged sword, leaving deep, festering wounds that would take centuries to heal. It was a stark reminder that in the ruthless pursuit of control, the VOC would stop at nothing, exploiting every weakness, every division, to achieve its singular, all-consuming goal. The question then arises, a chilling query echoing through the corridors of history. What horrors were truly committed to control the world's most desired flavors? The answer lies not just in the economic ledgers of Amsterdam, but in the mass graves of Banda, in the cries of the enslaved, and in the broken treaties that paved the way for an empire built on the bedrock of human suffering and corporate ruthlessness. The establishment of vast plantations, fueled by the relentless demand for spices and other exotic goods, became the physical manifestation of the VOC's economic might and moral bankruptcy. These sprawling agricultural enterprises, stretching across islands and continents, were entirely reliant on a brutal system of forced labor. Indigenous populations, stripped of their land and dignity, were pressed into service alongside countless enslaved individuals forcibly transported from other regions of Asia, and even from Africa. Men, women, and children toiled under the tropical sun, their bodies broken by back-breaking work, their spirits crushed by the unending cycle of exploitation. The conditions aboard VOC ships, packed with human cargo, were nothing short of horrific. Disease, starvation, and violence were rampant, turning the journey across vast oceans into a death sentence for untold numbers. Those who survived the treacherous voyages faced an equally bleak existence in the colonial outposts. Overcrowded, unsanitary living quarters, meager rations, and relentless work schedules defined their days. Floggings, mutilations, and executions were common punishments for even minor infractions, serving as chilling reminders of the absolute power wielded by their Dutch masters. The company's ledgers meticulously recorded the profits generated by these plantations, but they remained silent on the immeasurable human cost, the lives extinguished, the families torn apart, the cultures systematically dismantled. The impact on indigenous cultures and ecosystems was profound and often irreversible. Ancient traditions, passed down through generations, were suppressed or eradicated. Sacred lands were desecrated, their resources plundered to feed the insatiable appetite of European markets. The delicate balance of natural environments was disrupted as vast tracts of forest were cleared for monoculture plantations, leading to soil degradation and loss of biodiversity. The spiritual connection between the people and their land, a cornerstone of many indigenous societies, was severed, leaving a void that would echo through centuries. The VOC, in its relentless pursuit of profit, saw nature not as a provider to be respected, but as a commodity to be exploited without limit. Yet amidst this pervasive darkness, a few flickering embers of conscience occasionally stirred within the ranks of the VOC. There were rare instances of employees, often lower-ranking administrators or junior merchants, who found themselves grappling with the moral dilemmas inherent in their work. Witnessing firsthand the atrocities committed in the name of the company, some experienced profound internal struggles. A young Dutch clerk, meticulously recording the sales of nutmeg, might find his hand trembling as he simultaneously documented the brutal suppression of a native uprising. A ship's captain, accustomed to the harsh realities of colonial trade, might feel an unexpected pang of empathy for the suffering souls crammed below deck. These were not widespread movements of dissent, but rather isolated moments of personal anguish, often quickly suppressed by the chilling pragmatism of the company's ethos and the fear of reprisal. Such individuals rarely spoke out, knowing the futility and danger of challenging the monolithic power of the VOC. Their moral compasses, however, though often silenced, bore witness to the profound injustices unfolding around them. Inevitably, the relentless oppression bred resistance. Stories of rebellion, though often brutally suppressed, punctuated the VOC's reign. From the fierce, desperate revolts of the enslaved on their plantations to the organized, though often outmatched, resistance of indigenous chieftains, the spirit of defiance never entirely died. These acts of rebellion, whether planned uprisings or spontaneous outbursts of desperation, were met with overwhelming force. The company's formidable military, equipped with superior weaponry and disciplined training, crushed these movements with ruthless efficiency, making examples of leaders and participants to deter future insurrections. The bloodshed was immense, but each act of resistance, however futile in its immediate outcome, served as a defiant testament to the human spirit's refusal to be utterly subjugated. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the grim reality of the VOC's operations began to filter back to Europe. Whispers of atrocities, tales of immense suffering, and accounts of unspeakable cruelty started to penetrate the carefully constructed facade of prosperity and exotic trade. While the majority of Europeans remained blissfully unaware or willfully ignorant, focused on the affordable spices and silks that enriched their lives, a small but growing number of intellectuals, philosophers, and even some politicians began to question the ethical foundations of such vast, privately held power. The initial dawning realization of these atrocities, however, was often met with skepticism or dismissed as exaggerated tales. The economic benefits were too alluring, the narratives of colonial superiority too deeply ingrained for a widespread moral reckoning to occur swiftly. Nonetheless, the seeds of doubt were sown, hinting at a future where the true cost of empire might finally be confronted. The question echoes with a chilling resonance, carrying the weight of centuries of suffering. Can immense wealth ever truly justify such profound human suffering? The legacy of the VOC stands as a stark, uncompromising answer, etched in the blood-soaked soil of forgotten islands and the silent screams of generations past. Its riches were built upon a foundation of exploitation so absolute, a disregard for human life so complete, that the very notion of justification crumbles under the sheer weight of its barbarity. Yet even within the iron grip of the Dutch East India Company, a glimmer of conscience occasionally pierced the pervasive darkness. It was a fragile light, often flickering and easily extinguished, but it existed. Early critics, largely confined to academic circles and philosophical salons within the Netherlands, began to articulate nascent ideas about corporate power and the moral dimensions of colonial expansion. These were not revolutionaries, but thinkers grappling with the emerging contradictions of a nation that espoused Enlightenment ideals at home, while perpetrating unspeakable acts abroad. They debated the rights of indigenous peoples, questioned the legitimacy of conquest, and cautiously posited that even a company, no matter how powerful, should operate within certain ethical boundaries. Their voices, though initially faint, represented the first tremors of a societal introspection that would much later gain momentum. Attempts to regulate the VOC, born from these burgeoning ethical concerns, were largely toothless. The company's immense financial clout and political influence rendered such efforts symbolic at best. Petitions to the States General, parliamentary debates, and even royal decrees often founded against the VOC's unyielding will and its deeply entrenched network of power brokers. The company was, in many respects, a state within a state, its authority often superseding that of the Dutch Republic itself when it came to its overseas territories. Any proposed legislation that threatened its profit margins or operational autonomy was swiftly neutralized, a testament to the colossal challenge faced by those who dared to question its dominion. Amidst this vast machinery of exploitation, individual acts of defiance or quiet compassion were rare, almost mythical, but they did occur. A junior clerk might subtly misreport a shipment of stolen goods. A low-ranking soldier might turn a blind eye to a runaway slave, or a ship's surgeon might advocate for better conditions for the indentured laborers on board. These were not grand gestures of rebellion, but small, often anonymous moments where individual humanity asserted itself against the dehumanizing force of the company. Such acts were fraught with personal risk, often leading to dismissal, demotion, or worse, but they served as tiny cracks in the monolithic structure, proving that the human spirit, even when cornered, could retain a flicker of empathy. Consider the internal conflict of Willem van der Velde, a fictional but representative junior administrator stationed in Batavia during the mid-17th century. Willem, a young man from a respectable Amsterdam family, had joined the VOC with dreams of adventure and fortune. He envisioned himself contributing to the glory of the Republic, bringing order and prosperity to distant lands. But the reality he encountered was a brutal awakening. He saw the lash marks on the backs of the Javanese workers, heard the cries of children separated from their families, and witnessed the casual cruelty of his superiors. His initial idealism curdled into a bitter disillusionment. Each day, he meticulously recorded inventories of spices, timber, and slaves, his quill scratching across parchment, each stroke a silent complicity in the grand scheme of exploitation. He was good at his job, efficient and organized, but the moral weight of his tasks grew heavier with each passing week. He would lie awake at night, the humid air thick with the scent of spices and suffering, his mind replaying the day's injustices. He recalled the impassioned sermons of his childhood pastor, preaching charity and human dignity, notions that seemed utterly alien in the VOC's domain. One sweltering afternoon, he was tasked with overseeing the sale of a small family, a mother, father, and their 2 young children, who were deemed surplus from a recently acquired plantation. The children, barely more than toddlers, clung to their mother, their eyes wide with terror. Willem felt a cold dread in his stomach, a visceral rejection of the transaction he was about to facilitate. He saw not just commodities, but human beings, their fear palpable. A fleeting, Desperate thought crossed his mind. Could he forge the papers? Could he somehow arrange for their escape? The idea was immediately crushed by the daunting reality of the VOC's pervasive surveillance and the certain, severe punishment that would follow. He went through the motions, his face a mask of official indifference, but inside a profound sorrow settled upon him. He completed the transaction, the ink on the bill of sale, a stark testament to his complicity. Later that evening, he sought solace in a local tavern, drowning his conscience in cheap arrack, but the images of the family haunted him. He knew he was but a cog in a vast, uncaring machine. His individual compassion, however potent it felt within him, seemed utterly powerless against the behemoth that was the VOC. This brief, hopeful moment of potential change, born from the anguish of a few, was quickly overshadowed by the relentless pursuit of profit and power. The VOC's vast machinery continued to churn, fueled by the demand for exotic goods and the insatiable greed of its shareholders. The individual moral struggles, the quiet acts of dissent, were mere whispers against the roaring tide of corporate expansion. The company's influence was too profound, its reach too extensive, for such nascent ethical considerations to significantly alter its course. The empire built on exploitation continued its inexorable march, leaving a trail of human suffering in its wake, and posing a question that would echo through centuries. In an empire built on such foundations, could any individual truly make a difference? The answer, for now, remained a resounding and tragic no. The Dutch East India Company, unburdened by the fleeting pangs of individual conscience, pressed onward with its global ambitions. Its gaze, once fixed primarily on the Spice Islands, now swept across the vast canvas of the Indian Ocean and beyond, seeking new territories to conquer, new markets to dominate, and new resources to exploit. Ceylon, with its strategic location and cinnamon wealth, became a prime target, wrestled from Portuguese control with a ferocity that left no doubt about the VOC's military supremacy. The Cape Colony, at the southern tip of Africa, was transformed from a mere refreshment station into a burgeoning settlement, a vital link in the long chain of trade routes stretching from Amsterdam to Batavia. Even the isolationist shores of Japan, though resistant to full colonization, felt the VOC's presence, granted a unique, albeit restricted, trading foothold on the artificial island of Dejima. This relentless expansion, while cementing the VOC's status as a global hegemon, brought with it an ever-increasing administrative complexity. The sheer scale of its operations, spanning continents and cultures, began to strain the very structures that had once made it so efficient. Communication across vast distances was slow and unreliable, leading to delays and misinterpretations that hampered effective governance. The company's bureaucracy swelled, creating layers of officialdom where decisions became mired in paperwork and petty rivalries. With this expansion came the insidious creep of corruption. Far from the watchful eyes of the Heren 17 in Amsterdam, local governors and commanders in distant outposts often operated with near-absolute authority. The opportunities for personal enrichment were immense, and many succumbed to the temptation. Smuggling, embezzlement, and illicit private trading became rampant, siphoning off profits that should have flowed into the company's coffers. The system, designed to create wealth for shareholders, was increasingly being cannibalized from within by those entrusted to manage it. Adding to these internal pressures was the growing external threat from rival European powers. The British East India Company, initially a smaller, less formidable competitor, was rapidly gaining strength and ambition. The French, too, began to assert their presence in Asia, challenging the VOC's long-held monopolies. The global stage was becoming more crowded, and the struggle for dominance grew fiercer. Naval skirmishes and proxy wars became more frequent, forcing the VOC to divert ever-increasing resources towards military expenditures, maintaining a formidable fleet and garrisoning its numerous forts. These costs, once easily absorbed by the immense profits from spices, now began to bite into the company's financial stability. Within the hallowed halls of the Heren 17, the governing board in Amsterdam, internal power struggles intensified. Factions emerged, each vying for control, accusing the other of mismanagement, corruption, or strategic blunders. The unified vision that had propelled the VOC to greatness began to fracture under the weight of conflicting interests and personal agendas. Directors, once united by a common purpose, now often found themselves at odds, their debates growing more acrimonious, their decisions less cohesive. These accumulating pressures, both internal and external, began to manifest as the first unmistakable signs of financial strain and mismanagement. Dividends, once consistently high, started to fluctuate, causing concern among shareholders. Reports from distant outposts painted a picture of declining efficiency and rising costs. The company, once a symbol of impenetrable wealth and power, was starting to show cracks in its formidable facade. The relentless pursuit of profit had created a sprawling, unwieldy empire that was becoming increasingly difficult to control, its vastness now a liability rather than an asset. Even the mightiest empires, it seemed, had cracks in their foundations, and for the VOC, these fissures were beginning to widen, threatening the very structure that had once seemed invincible. The seeds of its eventual decline were being sown, not by a single cataclysmic event, but by a slow, insidious erosion from within and relentless pressure from without. The burgeoning cracks in the VOC's formidable facade were not merely structural, they reverberated across the vast territories it had so ruthlessly claimed. In the colonized regions, a deep, simmering resentment began to boil over, transforming isolated acts of defiance into organized, widespread rebellion. The iron fist of VOC rule, once perceived as unchallengeable, now met with increasingly determined resistance, often rooted in the very cultural and religious identities the company had sought to suppress. The sheer audacity of a foreign entity dictating their lives, seizing their lands and exploiting their labor had fostered a collective yearning for freedom that no amount of military might could permanently extinguish. The VOC, in its stubborn refusal to acknowledge the legitimacy of these grievances, responded with an escalation of its already harsh tactics. Fortifications were strengthened, garrisons increased, and punitive expeditions became more frequent and brutal. Villages suspected of harboring rebels were razed, crops destroyed, and any form of dissent met with swift, merciless retribution. This cycle of oppression and resistance, however, only served to fuel the flames of rebellion, hardening the resolve of those who sought to break free. The cost of maintaining this iron grip was enormous, draining the company's resources at an alarming rate and diverting funds that could have shored up its faltering finances. Each skirmish, each siege, each declaration of martial law chipped away at the VOC's once unlimited coffers, turning military control from an asset into a crushing liability. One of the most significant challenges to VOC supremacy emerged in the heart of what is now Indonesia, specifically in Java. For decades, the Mataram Sultanate, a powerful indigenous kingdom, had chafed under the Dutch presence. Their sovereignty steadily eroded by VOC treaties and military interventions. While earlier conflicts had seen the Sultanate largely outmaneuvered, the mid-18th century witnessed a resurgence of Javanese nationalism and a fierce determination to reclaim their ancestral lands. The seeds of rebellion were sown by figures like Prince Diponegoro, a charismatic leader who, though born later, embodied the spirit of resistance that began to coalesce during this period. The Javanese, armed with traditional weapons and an intimate knowledge of their rugged terrain, launched a series of guerrilla campaigns that proved incredibly costly for the Dutch. They targeted VOC outposts, disrupted supply lines, and engaged in hit-and-run attacks that kept the company's forces constantly on edge. The dense jungles and mountainous regions became their allies, turning the tide against the technologically superior European invaders. The VOC found itself entangled in a protracted and brutal war of attrition, one for which its mercantile structure was ill-suited. Its soldiers, often mercenaries from various European nations, suffered from tropical diseases, low morale, and a growing sense of futility. The logistics of supplying and reinforcing distant garrisons were a nightmare, stretching the company's administrative and financial capabilities to their breaking point. The Javanese resistance, though lacking centralized command and a unified army, compensated with an unwavering spirit and deep popular support. Farmers, villagers, and local chieftains, all weary of Dutch exploitation, provided intelligence, food, and refuge to the rebels, transforming the conflict into a widespread popular uprising rather than a mere military engagement. A particularly devastating blow to the VOC's prestige and military might occurred during the siege of a key VOC fort in central Java, a stronghold that had long symbolized Dutch dominance in the region. The Javanese forces, using ingenious tactics and a surprising degree of coordination, managed to isolate the fort, cutting off all supplies and reinforcements. The siege dragged on for months, a testament to both the defenders' stubbornness and the attackers' relentless pressure. When the fort finally fell, not through direct assault, but through starvation and disease, it sent shockwaves through the VOC's hierarchy. This was not just a military defeat, it was a psychological one. The aura of invincibility that had surrounded the VOC for so long was shattered, replaced by a growing realization that their empire, however vast, was vulnerable. The news of this defeat, though often downplayed by VOC officials in Amsterdam, spread like wildfire among other colonized peoples, igniting fresh hopes of liberation and inspiring further acts of defiance. The heavy cost of maintaining military control in Java, coupled with similar uprisings in other parts of the archipelago and Ceylon, began to drain the VOC's resources at an unsustainable pace. The company, which had once funded its wars with the immense profits from spices, now found itself borrowing heavily, accumulating vast debts to finance its increasingly desperate attempts to quell the spreading unrest. The cycle was vicious. Oppression bred rebellion, rebellion demanded military response, and military response devoured profits, leading to further economic strain and more desperate measures. The VOC was caught in a self-perpetuating crisis, its very attempts to reassert control, inadvertently accelerating its decline. The grand edifice of the world's first multinational corporation, built on trade and conquest, was now being slowly but surely dismantled by the relentless, unyielding spirit of those it had sought to subjugate. The question was no longer if the VOC would fall, but when, and what kind of world would emerge from its ashes. The VOC, once an unstoppable titan, now found itself dangerously overextended, a leviathan thrashing in waters that had grown too shallow for its immense bulk. Its very success had sown the seeds of its downfall. The company's rigid, hierarchical structure, once its strength, became a crippling liability, unable to adapt to the rapidly shifting geopolitical landscape of the late 18th century. The world was changing, and the VOC, mired in its colonial conquests and monopolistic mindset, failed to change with it. The age of unbridled corporate expansion was yielding to an era of burgeoning national identities and more sophisticated statecraft, where mercantilism was being challenged by emerging ideas of free trade and international diplomacy. This inability to adapt was brutally exposed with the outbreak of the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War in 1780. What began as a dispute over Dutch trade with the American colonies, then fighting for independence from Britain, quickly escalated into a full-blown naval conflict. For the VOC, this war was nothing short of catastrophic. Britain, with its rapidly expanding and professionalized Royal Navy, systematically targeted Dutch shipping and colonial outposts. The VOC's once formidable fleet, neglected and underfunded for decades in favor of land-based military excursions, proved no match for the British. Naval defeats became commonplace, each loss chipping away at the company's pride and, more importantly, its economic lifelines. Key trade routes, once exclusively controlled by the VOC, were now vulnerable, and many fell into British hands. The lucrative spice convoys, which had for so long symbolized Dutch prosperity, were intercepted, their precious cargo seized, inflicting immense financial blows. The loss of these vital trade routes was akin to severing the company's arteries. Without the steady flow of goods and the profits they generated, the VOC's financial structure began to crumble. The massive debt accumulated from years of military campaigns, mismanagement, and rampant corruption now swelled to unmanageable proportions. The company, which had once commanded the wealth of nations, found itself on the brink of bankruptcy, struggling to pay its soldiers, maintain its forts, and even fund its basic administrative functions. The once mighty VOC, with its vast global network, was bleeding money from every pore. Adding to this external pressure was a festering internal decay. The war, while exposing the company's weaknesses, also brought to light the extent of the corruption and embezzlement that had permeated the highest levels of the VOC. Governors-general and senior officials in distant colonies, far from the watchful eye of the Heeren 17th in Amsterdam, had long enriched themselves through illicit trade, bribery, and the blatant siphoning off of company resources. Stories of lavish lifestyles maintained on stolen funds, while the company itself teetered on collapse, began to leak back to the Netherlands, fueling widespread public outrage. The trust that had once underpinned the VOC's semi-sovereign status evaporated, replaced by a deep sense of betrayal among the Dutch populace. The public outcry was swift and severe. Pamphlets and newspapers, no longer intimidated by the company's power, openly lambasted its leadership, detailing instances of cruelty in the colonies and financial malfeasance at home. The very name of the VOC, once a source of national pride, now became synonymous with greed, corruption, and moral decay. Shareholders, many of whom were ordinary citizens who had invested their life savings, saw their fortunes vanish, further eroding faith in the company's leadership. The government, which had for so long benefited from the VOC's wealth and global influence, found itself facing intense pressure to intervene. The company's once unquestioned authority was now openly challenged, its every action scrutinized. The aura of invincibility, cultivated over 2 centuries, was irrevocably shattered. The grand experiment of a corporate empire, built on an unprecedented scale of power and profit, was collapsing under the weight of its own hubris. The VOC, blinded by its past glories and intoxicated by its absolute power, had failed to see the writing on the wall. Its refusal to adapt, its internal rot, and its over-reliance on brutal force had created a perfect storm. The question that lingered in the air, thick with the scent of impending doom, was not if this titan would fall, but how spectacular its demise would be, and what lessons humanity might draw from the shattering of such unchecked power. The world watched as the once $7 trillion company, a symbol of Dutch might, began its agonizing descent into oblivion, a stark reminder of how quickly unchecked power can lead to its own downfall. The Dutch government, once a staunch patron and silent beneficiary of the VOC's colossal profits, could no longer turn a blind eye to the escalating crisis. The public's fury was a tidal wave, threatening to engulf not just the company, but the very political stability of the nation. Intervention became not merely an option, but a desperate necessity. Committees were formed, inquiries launched, and, for the first time in its history, the VOC found itself subjected to intense scrutiny from the very state that had granted it its extraordinary charter. What began as an investigation into financial mismanagement quickly spiraled into a damning indictment of systemic corruption and horrific humanitarian abuses committed across its vast empire. Investigators, armed with unprecedented access, unearthed a labyrinthine network of deceit, financial ledgers, meticulously kept in some instances but deliberately obscured in others, revealed decades of misappropriation of funds. Governors-general, once revered as titans of industry and colonial administration, were exposed as grand embezzlers, their personal fortunes swollen by kickbacks, illicit trade, and the systematic exploitation of resources meant for the company's coffers. Bills of lading were falsified, cargo manifests manipulated, and entire shipments of valuable spices and goods vanished into the private pockets of officials. The sheer scale of the financial irregularities was staggering, far exceeding even the most cynical estimates. It was not merely isolated acts of greed, but an ingrained culture of corruption that had metastasized throughout the company's hierarchy, from the humblest clerk to the most powerful director. But the financial revelations were only one facet of the unfolding horror. As testimonies from former employees, disgruntled sailors, and even a few courageous missionaries trickled in, the true extent of the humanitarian abuses came to light: the brutal suppression of native populations, the forced labor, the massacres in the Spice Islands, the inhumane conditions aboard VOC ships, and the institutionalized cruelty in its colonial outposts. All were laid bare. The stories, once whispered in hushed tones or dismissed as exaggerations, now formed a chilling narrative of unchecked power and moral depravity. The Dutch public, once proud of its global trading empire, was forced to confront the unspeakable atrocities committed in its name. The romanticized image of intrepid explorers and shrewd merchants shattered, replaced by the grim reality of a corporate machine built on exploitation and bloodshed. The exposure of these truths led to a series of public trials unprecedented in their scope and impact. While not every corrupt official or cruel administrator faced justice, several high-profile figures were brought before tribunals. These were not mere administrative hearings, they were spectacles that captivated the nation. The trials served as a crucial reckoning, a public catharsis for a society grappling with the moral bankruptcy of its most iconic institution. Witnesses, often trembling with fear but emboldened by the changing tide, recounted tales of unimaginable suffering and rampant abuse. The defense, often relying on the legalistic arguments of corporate prerogative and the necessities of maintaining order in distant lands, rang hollow against the weight of human testimony. Though true justice remained elusive for countless victims, these proceedings irrevocably stained the reputations of those involved and exposed the dark underbelly of colonial enterprise. The impact of these revelations on Dutch society and national identity was profound and traumatic. The VOC had been more than just a company. It was a symbol of Dutch ingenuity, economic prowess, and global ambition. Its fall, and the manner of its fall, forced a painful re-evaluation of the nation's past and its moral compass. The immense wealth that had flowed into the Netherlands, fueling its golden age, now seemed tainted, stained with the blood and suffering of millions. The very foundations of Dutch prosperity were questioned, leading to a deep sense of collective guilt and disillusionment. The nation struggled to reconcile its self-image as a beacon of enlightenment and trade with the brutal reality of its corporate empire. Amidst this national introspection, A final dramatic act of betrayal from within the VOC itself solidified its demise. A high-ranking director, a man named Van der Veer, who had long harbored a quiet disdain for the company's increasingly ruthless methods and the blatant corruption of his peers, chose this moment of vulnerability to leak a comprehensive dossier of incriminating documents to the lead investigator. These documents, meticulously collected over years, detailed the most egregious financial crimes, the systematic cover-ups of atrocities, and the complicity of even the most revered members of the Heren 17. Van der Veer's motive was complex, a mix of moral conscience, personal vendetta against rivals, and perhaps a desperate attempt to salvage some semblance of honor from the crumbling edifice. His betrayal was the final nail in the coffin, providing incontrovertible proof that the rot was not merely superficial, but had consumed the company's very core. The question that had lingered for so long of who would pay the ultimate price for the VOC's unchecked power was now being answered, not just in the public square, but in the agonizing self-reflection of a nation. The formal dissolution of the Dutch East India Company, the Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie, came on December 31st, 1799. It was not a sudden cataclysmic event, but rather the quiet, inevitable end of a two-century-long saga. The grand experiment in corporate power, once the envy and terror of the world, simply ceased to exist as an independent entity. The company's charter, which had granted it unparalleled authority, was allowed to expire. There were no grand pronouncements or celebratory fanfares, only the weary acceptance of a debt-ridden, morally bankrupt institution that had outlived its purpose and its solvency. The nationalization of its assets and debts by the Dutch government was a monumental undertaking. The state inherited an empire in name, but a financial quagmire in reality. The VOC's vast holdings, its forts, trading posts, ships and plantations scattered across Asia and Africa became the property of the Batavian Republic, the revolutionary successor state to the Dutch Republic. But with these assets came an astronomical debt, estimated at over 100 million guilders, a sum that dwarfed the national budget and would burden the Dutch treasury for decades. The state, now inextricably linked to the colonial enterprise, found itself grappling with the very same administrative complexities and moral compromises that had plagued the company. The transition was less about dismantling an empire and more about absorbing its colossal weight. For the former VOC employees, the immediate aftermath was a period of profound uncertainty and disruption. Thousands of administrators, soldiers, sailors and clerks, from the highest-ranking governors to the lowliest cabin boys, found their careers abruptly terminated. Many were left adrift, their livelihoods tied to a company that no longer existed. Some were absorbed into the nascent colonial administration of the Batavian Republic, their skills and experience deemed indispensable for managing the newly nationalized territories. Others, however, faced unemployment, their futures uncertain in a world reshaped by political upheaval and the collapse of their corporate giant. The personal stories of these individuals, often overlooked in the grand narrative of the VOC's demise, reflect the human cost of such a colossal corporate failure. Their lives, once defined by the company's vast reach, now had to be redefined in its absence. The enduring legacy of the VOC's colonial policies and exploitation cast a long, dark shadow over the lands it once dominated. The systems of forced labor, resource extraction, and economic monopolies it had established did not vanish with the company's dissolution. Instead, they were often simply reappropriated and continued, albeit under new management. The fundamental structures of colonial power, designed to enrich the metropole at the expense of the periphery, remained largely intact. Indigenous economies had been irrevocably altered. traditional social structures dismantled, and local populations subjected to generations of subjugation. The concept of self-determination, so alien to the VOC's profit-driven philosophy, would take centuries to emerge and even longer to achieve. The lingering scars on the lands and peoples it once controlled were profound and multifaceted. In the Banda Islands, the population had been decimated, their culture shattered, and their fertile lands transformed into monoculture plantations. Across Indonesia, the Dutch colonial state, the successor to the VOC, would continue to exploit vast natural resources and impose its will through military force. In Ceylon, the coffee and later tea plantations, established on the foundations of VOC land grabs, would continue to thrive on the back of exploited labor. The Cape Colony, originally a refreshment station for VOC ships, had become a nascent settler colony, laying the groundwork for centuries of racial segregation and conflict. The geographical boundaries, economic dependencies, and social hierarchies engineered by the VOC would continue to shape these regions long after its demise. A poignant reflection on the human cost of its 200-year reign reveals a tapestry woven with threads of unimaginable suffering and immense wealth. The spices that graced European tables, the textiles that adorned their elite, and the exotic goods that filled their coffers were all purchased at an exorbitant price, the lives, cultures, and freedoms of millions. The VOC, in its relentless pursuit of profit, had pioneered a model of global capitalism that prioritized corporate interest above all else, foreshadowing many of the ethical dilemmas that continue to plague the modern world. Its story serves as a chilling testament to the seductive power of unchecked economic might and the devastating consequences when humanity is sacrificed at the altar of commerce. Does an empire ever truly die, or does it merely change form? The question echoes through the corridors of history. The VOC as a corporate entity ceased to exist, but the colonial project it initiated, the economic systems it entrenched, and the global power imbalances it exacerbated continued under the guise of state governance. The ghost of corporate power, having tasted the limitless potential of global exploitation, would merely find new vessels and new names in the centuries to come, ensuring that the legacy of the $7 trillion company would resonate far beyond its formal dissolution. The ghost of corporate power, having tasted the limitless potential of global exploitation, would merely find new vessels and new names in the centuries to come, ensuring that the legacy of the $7 trillion company would resonate far beyond its formal dissolution. This spectral presence lingers even today, casting its shadow over modern corporate power and the intricate web of globalization that defines our contemporary world. The story of the VOC, while rooted in the 17th century, offers a stark, prescient mirror reflecting the ethical responsibilities that corporations grapple with in the 21st century. The very concept of corporate personhood, a legal fiction that grants companies many of the rights and responsibilities of individuals, can be traced, in part, to the unprecedented autonomy and power wielded by the VOC. This legal construct, designed to facilitate commerce and innovation, simultaneously introduce the potential for immense, unchecked power. When a corporation is treated as a person but operates without the moral compass or the finite lifespan of a human being, the dangers become palpable. The VOC embodied this paradox perfectly, a legal entity capable of waging war, signing treaties, and controlling vast populations, yet ultimately driven by the singular, amoral imperative of profit. Its history forces a critical examination of whether such legal fictions, when untethered from robust ethical frameworks and genuine accountability, inevitably lead to exploitation and abuse. The dangers of unchecked power, regardless of the entity wielding it, remain a recurring theme throughout human history. The VOC's narrative serves as a chilling testament to how quickly economic might can morph into political dominance and then into instruments of oppression. Whether it is a colonial trading company, a modern multinational conglomerate, or even a state-owned enterprise, the fundamental dynamics remain eerily similar. When power is concentrated, when oversight is weak, and when the pursuit of profit or geopolitical advantage becomes the sole driving force, the consequences for human rights, environmental sustainability, and social equity are often devastating. The history of the VOC is not merely a tale of the past. It is a cautionary fable for the present. The recurring themes of profit over people, environmental destruction, and exploitation resonate profoundly in our current global landscape. From sweatshops producing fast fashion to mining operations devastating indigenous lands, from financial institutions profiting from global crises to tech giants wielding unprecedented influence over information, the echoes of the VOC are unmistakable. The drive to maximize shareholder value, often at any cost, mirrors the VOC's relentless pursuit of spice monopolies. The externalization of social and environmental costs, pushing the burden onto vulnerable communities and future generations, is a direct lineage from the VOC's colonial practices. The sophisticated legal and financial structures designed to shield corporate actors from accountability bear a striking resemblance to the VOC's sovereign powers. This historical lens offers a crucial moment of introspection on the lessons learned from history. Have we, as a global society, truly internalized the profound moral failings of the VOC? Or have we merely refined the methods, making exploitation more subtle, more legally defensible, but no less damaging? The sheer scale of global commerce today, the interconnectedness of supply chains, and the pervasive influence of corporate lobbying in political systems suggest that the spirit of the VOC, albeit in a more sophisticated guise, continues to thrive. The question looms large. Are we doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past on a new global stage simply because the mechanisms of power have evolved, but the underlying human frailties and temptations remain constant? It is a question that demands an honest and urgent answer, for the consequences of ignoring history are often condemned to be relived. The story of the VOC is not just history, it is a continuous warning. The shadows of the past, cast by the colossal entity that was the VOC, stretch far beyond its formal dissolution, reaching into the present day where the quest for justice and reconciliation continues. In former VOC territories, the arduous work of confronting historical injustices and seeking reparations has become a defining mission for many. Descendants of those who suffered under the company's brutal dominion, their ancestors enslaved, dispossessed, and brutalized, are actively engaged in campaigns to reclaim their heritage, demand recognition, and secure some measure of recompense for generations of systemic oppression. These movements are not merely about financial restitution, they are profoundly about healing historical wounds, restoring dignity, and rewriting narratives that were long suppressed or distorted by the victors. Modern initiatives for ethical sourcing, fair trade, and corporate social responsibility represent a direct, if sometimes belated, response to the kind of unchecked exploitation epitomized by the VOC. Companies today, at least outwardly, strive to project an image of ethical conduct, scrutinizing their supply chains for child labor, unsafe working conditions, and environmental degradation. Consumers, increasingly aware of the global impact of their purchasing decisions, demand transparency and accountability. The fair trade movement, for instance, directly challenges the exploitative trade practices that allowed the VOC to amass its vast wealth by ensuring producers in developing countries receive a fair price for their goods, along with safe working conditions and sustainable practices. These efforts, though often imperfect and facing immense challenges from the relentless pressures of global capitalism, signify a collective aspiration towards a more just economic order, one that actively seeks to prevent a repeat of the VOC's history. The challenge, however, remains immense: how to balance the relentless pursuit of economic progress with the fundamental imperatives of human rights and environmental sustainability. The modern global economy, with its intricate web of production and consumption, constantly tests the limits of ethical behavior. The allure of cheap labor, abundant resources, and new markets often overshadows the moral considerations, mirroring the VOC's own logic. Yet, within this complex landscape, countless individuals are dedicating their lives to bridging this chasm, working tirelessly to heal historical wounds and forge a more equitable future. Consider the stories of activists in the Banda Islands, where the genocide orchestrated by Jan Pieter Zoon Cohen left an indelible scar. Generations later, their descendants are not only preserving the memory of the atrocities, but are also advocating for sustainable tourism that benefits local communities rather than external corporations. They seek to tell their own history, to ensure that the world remembers the true cost of nutmeg. In South Africa, the legacy of the VOC's slave trade, which established the Cape Colony as a vital way station, continues to be addressed through educational programs and cultural initiatives aimed at acknowledging the suffering of enslaved peoples and celebrating their enduring resilience. These are not just abstract historical exercises. They are deeply personal journeys for individuals grappling with intergenerational trauma and the long shadow of colonial violence. These personal stories of individuals working to heal historical wounds are powerful testaments to the human spirit's capacity for resilience and hope. They represent a collective refusal to allow the past to dictate an unchangeable future. Whether it is a historian meticulously uncovering forgotten narratives, an artist creating works that confront colonial legacies, or an activist fighting for land rights for indigenous communities, each effort contributes to a broader movement towards justice. These actions, however small they may seem in the face of such monumental historical injustices, collectively chip away at the edifice of inherited suffering, paving the way for dialogue, understanding, and ultimately reconciliation. A sense of hope for a more equitable future, though tempered by the acknowledgement of immense challenges, pervades these efforts. The path to true redemption is neither linear nor easy, fraught with resistance from those who benefit from the status quo and the sheer weight of historical inertia. Yet, the very act of seeking justice, of demanding accountability, and of striving for a world where profit does not inherently trump human dignity, signifies a profound shift. It suggests a growing global consciousness that recognizes the interconnectedness of past and present, and the imperative to learn from the darkest chapters of human history. Can humanity truly achieve redemption for its past transgressions? This is the central, haunting question that emerges from the long, brutal saga of the VOC. Redemption implies not just an acknowledgement of wrongdoing, but a fundamental change in behavior, a commitment to never repeat such errors. It demands a willingness to dismantle systems of power that perpetuate inequality and exploitation, and to actively build structures that prioritize justice, fairness, and the well-being of all people. The journey is far from over, but the ongoing struggles for reparations, the rise of ethical consumerism, and the tireless work of human rights advocates all point towards a collective yearning for a world where the lessons of the VOC are not merely remembered, but truly internalized and acted upon. The struggle for redemption is, in essence, the struggle for a more humane future. The journey towards a more humane future, however, is deeply intertwined with the visible and invisible scars that the VOC's reign left upon the world. The physical landscape itself still bears witness to its ambition and brutality. From the remnants of Dutch forts scattered across the Indonesian archipelago to the colonial architecture that still defines parts of Colombo in Sri Lanka, and the distinctive Cape Dutch style dotting the South African landscape, the VOC's presence is etched into the very stones of these nations. These structures, once symbols of dominance, now stand as stark reminders of a bygone era, often repurposed but never fully detached from their historical origins. They serve as tangible links to a past that refuses to be forgotten, silent sentinels guarding stories of both oppression and remarkable resilience. Beyond the architectural footprint, the VOC's lasting impact resonates deeply within languages, religions, and social structures. In Indonesia, traces of Dutch words are woven into the national language, Bahasa Indonesia, a linguistic legacy of centuries of interaction and subjugation. Christianity, introduced by European missionaries, often under the protection of VOC guns, became firmly established in certain regions, profoundly altering indigenous belief systems. The very fabric of society in many former colonial territories was irrevocably changed, with new hierarchies imposed, traditional governance structures dismantled, and economic systems reoriented to serve the demands of the global spice trade. These shifts created divisions and inequalities that persist to this day, manifesting in socio-economic disparities and political tensions. The psychological and intergenerational trauma of colonialism, a less visible but equally potent scar, continues to ripple through generations. It is a trauma that manifests in myriad ways, in the loss of cultural identity, in internalized inferiority, in the disruption of family lines, and in the enduring struggle for self-determination. Descendants of those who suffered under the VOC's yoke often carry an unspoken burden, a collective memory of injustice that shapes their understanding of the world and their place within it. This trauma is not merely a historical footnote, it is a lived reality for countless individuals, influencing mental health, community cohesion, and national narratives. These profound and enduring impacts fuel ongoing debates and controversies surrounding historical statues and monuments related to the VOC. In the Netherlands, discussions about statues of figures like Jan Pieterszoon Cohen, revered by some as a national hero and reviled by others as a genocidal colonizer, highlight the deep divisions in how the past is remembered and commemorated. These debates are not just about bronze and stone. They are about national identity, about acknowledging historical guilt, and about deciding whose stories are deemed worthy of public honor. For the communities whose ancestors were brutalized by the VOC, these monuments often represent a painful glorification of their oppressors, a constant reminder of unaddressed injustices. The calls for removal or recontextualization of such statues are not an attempt to erase history, but rather to ensure that history is told truthfully and inclusively, reflecting the experiences of all those affected. Yet, amidst these profound scars and ongoing struggles, there is a powerful, emotional segment of humanity that showcases an enduring human spirit despite oppression. It is the spirit of resilience, of cultural preservation, of quiet defiance that refuse to be extinguished. It is seen in the survival of indigenous languages and traditions, in the vibrant artistic expressions that emerged from periods of intense suffering, and in the unwavering determination of communities to reclaim their heritage. This resilience is a testament to the indomitable strength of the human will, a refusal to be defined solely by the trauma inflicted upon them. It is in the stories passed down through generations, often whispered in hushed tones, that the true spirit of resistance and survival lives on, a flickering flame against the darkest nights. In the quiet reflection of a descendant, the weight of this history often becomes intensely personal. Perhaps it is a young woman in Banda, tracing her lineage back to a survivor of Cohen's massacre, feeling the echoes of ancestral pain, but also the fierce pride of endurance. Or perhaps it is a Dutch historian, grappling with the uncomfortable truths of their nation's past, feeling a complex mix of shame and a profound responsibility to ensure such atrocities are never repeated. This personal reflection, whether from a victim's or a perpetrator's descendant, brings the grand narrative of the VOC down to a human scale, making the historical abstract painfully real. It forces a confrontation with the question, how do we live with and learn from the indelible marks of history? The answer lies not in forgetting nor in mere acknowledgement, but in an active, conscious engagement with the past to build a better present and future. The story of the Dutch East India Company, the VOC, remains a stark, unblinking mirror reflecting the darkest corners of human ambition. Its meteoric rise from an innovative trading venture to a global behemoth wielding the power of nations and its eventual ignominious fall serves as a timeless testament to the corrupting nature of absolute power. For nearly 2 centuries, the VOC operated with an autonomy and reach almost unimaginable, transforming global commerce and leaving an indelible, often bloody, mark across continents. It pioneered corporate structures that resonate even today, yet it simultaneously perfected methods of exploitation and cruelty that shock the modern conscience. Its narrative is not just a historical account, it is a profound warning, etched in the annals of time, about the perils of unchecked economic and political might. The VOC's legacy underscores the critical importance of accountability, transparency, and ethical governance, both for corporations and for the states that empower them. In an era where multinational corporations often wield influence comparable to or even exceeding that of sovereign nations, the lessons from the VOC's downfall are more relevant than ever. The company's internal corruption, its systematic dehumanization of entire populations for profit, and its ultimate collapse under the weight of its own hubris highlight the inherent dangers when profit is prioritized above all else. Without robust oversight, without a moral compass guiding economic endeavors, and without the unwavering commitment to human rights, even the most innovative and powerful entities are susceptible to the same destructive forces that dismantled the VOC. The clamor for corporate social responsibility, for fair labor practices, and for environmental stewardship today echoes the silent cries of those who suffered under the VOC's relentless pursuit of wealth. This history demands a constant vigilance against similar abuses in the future. The mechanisms of exploitation may evolve, the commodities sought may change, and the geographical targets may shift. But the underlying human tendencies towards greed and dominance remain. The VOC reminds us that power, when concentrated and unchecked, inevitably leads to oppression. It compels us to question the narratives of progress that gloss over profound human costs, and to scrutinize the structures that allow vast wealth to accumulate at the expense of vulnerable communities. The past is not merely a collection of events, it is a living lesson, a guidepost for navigating the complexities of the present and shaping a more just future. The concluding thought, therefore, is not one of despair, but of profound responsibility. The story of the VOC is a dramatic, thought-provoking statement that leaves the viewer with a lasting impression that history is not a passive spectator sport. It is an active dialogue between the past and the present, demanding our engagement, our critical thought, and our moral courage. Every decision made today, whether in boardrooms, legislative chambers, or individual choices, contributes to the ongoing tapestry of human experience. The question that ultimately lingers, echoing through the centuries from the shattered dreams of Banda to the bustling ports of Amsterdam, is this: What kind of world will we choose to build for the next generation? Will it be one where the pursuit of profit once again overshadows the sanctity of life and the dignity of all peoples, or one where the hard-won lessons of history guide us towards a future founded on justice, equity, and shared prosperity? The answer, as always, lies within us.